Hello, friends, and welcome to Living Light. Today, we have probably one of the most important topics that we discuss with our clients, and a topic that is becoming more and more relevant to society, especially as our food supplies degrade and people become more and more aware of the ingredients of our food and the impact that it has on not only our global health, but digestion. Every year, over 70 million people complain or have some form of digestive dysfunction. In fact, today in the sauna, I was having a conversation with a group of men, and many of them were complaining about their digestive dysfunction. And one even mentioned how his wife was complaining about bloating, also in our world known as SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And many times people could be eating what they consider a healthy diet, but when the bacteria is in the wrong place, it can create some issues for us or for our clients. And so digestion is a topic we discuss over and over and over. And today, what Deepa and I are going to be talking about is how to assess digestive function, how to improve digestive function, simple things that you can do as always to enhance your, how you show up in the world, but also how you and your body interact. And we'll talk a little bit about diet and nutrition, of course, because that's what goes into our digestive system, but there's more to it than most people think. In fact, the digestive system starts in the mouth, not in the stomach, which is how we usually associate digestion. So we'll get into all that today. If you're enjoying what we're sharing and you've watched a few of our episodes, or even if you haven't, and you just like the idea of living a healthy, holistic lifestyle, please subscribe, comment below. We love seeing your questions and the comments that come in from what we're sharing. And of course, share this with somebody who you think would benefit from the information. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome my amazing wife and co-host, Deepa. Deepa, how are you today?
I'm doing well, thanks.
All right, awesome. I know that digestion is a topic that comes up very often. And we have a formula that we use called the 5 Cs. And that 5 Cs, I think, serves as a great framework for our session today. So we can go through those. The first C is to choose, and we'll talk about what that is and unpack that a little bit more. The next one is to chew, which can be somewhat self-explanatory, but most people don't chew their food, and we'll talk about the importance of that. The next one is to chill, which is to shift the state of your nervous system, and we'll discuss ways to do that. The next one is to cherish, to have gratitude for what we're eating, and that helps us shift gears as well. And the last one is check. So looking at your stool, analyzing it visually, but then also what can the smell of our stool tell us? What can the smell of our gas tell us? Like, there's clues that we can tap into. And then, of course, functional lab testing, which is something that we do with our clients that can give us even deeper insights into digestive function. And there's different ways that we could test, right? We could look at the oral microbiome. We can look at the microbiome of the bowel and the gut. We can look at functional stool analysis, breath tests. I mean, there's different ways to assess the gut, and we'll get into all those. And then, of course, as always, we're going to discuss natural solutions and remedies that we found to be super helpful. So with that being said, Deepa, maybe I think this is a good time to share your bowel obstruction story, because you've had some intimate experience with digestive function, and there's a whole spectrum of digestive disorders. And maybe you could share a little bit more about your experience with your bowel obstruction.
Yeah, so I've had 3 bowel obstructions, 2 which required surgery, and 1 which I was able to, maybe that could be another podcast episode, but with the right mindset and visualization, I was able to avoid surgery and resolve it on its own. But one of the key takeaways is just realizing the importance of our digestive system, even, little things like passing gas, right? That usually is an indication that things are not blocked anymore, that things are moving. So that was a really important realization. But I think when I had my 3rd bowel obstruction, I was eating a lot of celery like the week leading up to it. And I'm someone who is a little bit of a faster eater. I'm usually one of the first ones that's finished at the dinner table when we're eating as a family. And for me, one of the things that I have to really consciously remind myself of each and every day is chewing my food more, specifically very fibrous food, right? Things like celery and broccoli stalks, Those are very fibrous foods. Pineapple, right? So you really have to chew these foods well, because we don't have the enzymes to break down these foods. So we really got to chew with our mouth, right? I know you've said before that our stomach doesn't have teeth, right? So this is the one opportunity that you get to chew your food well. Once you swallow it, there's no other opportunity to break it down even further. So really realizing the importance of chewing well, not just if you have issues with small bowel obstructions, but just in general. When we chew our food, we break open the cell wall and we increase the surface area of the food, which means that we're better able to extract the nutrients and absorb the nutrients from that food. And many times, many people focus a lot on what they eat, but one of the things when it comes to digestion is they're not really focusing on how they're eating, right? And that's why we came up with the 5 C's and really having people focus more on that how rather than the what, right? The what is important too, but the how is equally, if not more important.
Yeah, what's really ironic in some cases is that some people may be eating really healthy and they still have digestive issues, and the person sitting next to them is eating what they might consider unhealthy food and they have no problems. And so they're left kind of scratching their head, maybe frustrated, maybe even jealous, or thinking, why am I spending all this time, energy, money trying to eat healthy when this person doesn't practice those behaviors and doesn't have these challenges and issues? So we'll share a little bit more about that, and hopefully by the end of this, people are able to continue eating healthy, but they understand why eating healthy actually requires additional attention, right? Now, one thing to keep in mind is that people who are eating processed foods, the food is already like almost partially digested for them, right? If you take something like a Dorito, right? The corn is already ground into a flour, and then it essentially dissolves. If you were to put a Dorito in water, it would dissolve, which doesn't require a lot of chewing. But if you were to eat corn on the cob, for example, you'd actually have to chew it to break it all open and extract the nutrition from it. So that would require a little bit more effort. So processed foods are mechanically processed in such a way that they don't require as much chewing. And this is actually done very intentionally by food scientists. So they've realized, that the less you chew, the more hungry you feel. And this is why a potato chip or a, Dorito or, a cracker or something that is, orchestrated or created in a lab doesn't actually allow you to chew it very much. It disintegrates in your mouth within just a few bites. And that's why you can eat the entire bag and still feel hungry afterwards, because your brain is counting, whether you like to think of it that way or not, it's counting the number of bites you take to kind of calculate how much food is coming. And that is part of the satiation signal. Another thing that's part of the satiation signal is peptides. Peptides like GLP-1, which you hear a lot about these days. These peptides are actually dependent on not just the food that you eat, like bitter foods, for example, signal these peptides to secrete, but also the fact that your vagus nerve is sending that message from the small intestine into and towards the brain and signaling that you've eaten enough. That is also very important. So there's all kinds of things that affect our hunger cues and signal to our body that we've eaten enough. And chewing is certainly one of them. So it's important that we, when we are going to choose the right foods, that we are making it a special point to chew that food. And we see this a lot with women. So one thing that we find is that, and not to be stereotypical, this is just what we see over and over again, is that women are generally the ones preparing the meals, serving the meals, making sure everyone is fed. And oftentimes they're running back and forth from the kitchen to the table or to the stovetop to the table. And they might be eating while they're standing or eating in a rush and not really, paying attention to how well they're chewing their food. So it's easy to overlook. And unfortunately, that results in maldigestion. As you mentioned, Deepa, the surface area is not increased as much as it should be. And a simple analogy for people is, imagine you had 5 pounds of ice, a 5-pound block of ice versus 5 pounds of crushed ice. Which one would melt faster? And the answer is the crushed ice, because there's more surface area and it would be in a puddle within a few minutes, whereas a block of ice, you can come back a day later and you'll still see remnants of that block of ice. So food is kind of the same way. We want to break open the cell walls, especially of our plant foods. If you swallow a salad, you'll poop a salad the next day, or however long your transit time is. And so many people don't realize that the quality of their chewing is what determines the quality of the nutrients or the amount of nutrients they'll absorb, because the human digestive system lacks the enzyme cellulase, which actually would dissolve through that cell wall. So we don't have that enzyme, animals do, which means that we have to chew our food with a very intentional energy. So that's chewing. Well, certainly we can talk more about that. And one thing that maybe we can go back to is the 5 C's. And let's just start with choose. So there's certain parameters around choosing, certainly choosing the right food. So maybe Deepa, you can share with us, like, what are some of the things that you instruct your clients in terms of what foods to choose, and maybe you can even talk about the foods that we choose to eat at home as well.
Yeah, so when it comes to choosing foods, I think intuitively we all know what's healthy versus what's not healthy, right? So we want to stick to whole foods as much as possible, foods that don't have a huge ingredient list, right? So lots of fruits, vegetables, healthy proteins, nuts, seeds, perhaps. When you go to the grocery store to buy an apple, it's just an apple, right? Whereas if you go to the grocery store to buy a bag of chips, it's like 10 plus ingredients in some cases. So really sticking to whole foods as much as possible is going to be in your best interest, because they're going to be the most unprocessed foods and, anti-inflammatory as well, right? We see a lot of people who come to us who have a lot of inflammation and pain, and it's really removing a lot of those refined processed foods that helps bring the inflammation down in their bodies. So that's just a general rule of thumb, is just start eating. A lot of times some practitioners will start with removing a lot of foods, but if you're new to this, the main thing you want to do is just start adding more whole foods to your diet, which will naturally crowd out some of the processed foods, right? Because when you eat a fiber-rich diet, a diet that's rich in protein and healthy fats, you're not going to feel hungry, right? Whereas when you eat something like a bag of chips or crackers, those are pretty much empty calories, and it's going to leave you feeling hungry even after you eat those foods. So foods that are satiating, foods that are healthy and whole is the general rule of thumb.
Yeah, one good tip that I got from my mentor, James Chestnut, he would say, eat fresh fiber first. So, try to eat your salad first. And that's why usually they serve salads, either as an appetizer or pre-meal. And so filling up and loading up, chewing, extensively chewing that salad, breaking open the cell walls. The rule of thumb is you want to drink your solids. So any solid foods that you're eating, you want to turn them into a fine paste, kind of the texture of salsa, if you will, before you swallow them, because that's going to increase the surface area and break open the cell walls so that you can extract nutrition. And the rule of thumb is about 30 to 40 bites, again, depending on what you're eating. But if you could do that, that's going to make a huge difference. When we chew, it also tells our brain that food is coming, and it shifts us into a more parasympathetic state, starts the production of stomach acid, which is kind of the next part of digestion. And when we make enough stomach acid, we start killing pathogens, bacteria, and things like that. But we also activate enzymes that help us break down our proteins into amino acids, which we can absorb further down in the system. So, chewing as an example sets off a cascade, and processed foods don't really require much chewing, whereas whole foods do and must be chewed in order for proper nutrient extraction to take place. The other part of choosing the right time to eat. And so, you could have the exact same meal, but if you're having that meal, midday versus after the sun goes down, it's going to have a different biological effect. So perhaps you could talk about meal timing. I think that's something that often gets overlooked, because we've been convinced that a calorie is a calorie. And, I think that old adage needs to die. We're not bomb calorimeters. There's hormones, there's enzymes, there's how well you chew your food. There's a state of your nervous system. Like all these things factor into what's going to happen to the exact same meal in one body versus somebody else's body. So maybe you could talk about choosing meal timing as an appropriate, way to improve and enhance digestion.
Yeah, so when it comes to meal timing, our bodies are most insulin sensitive earlier on in the day. So, a lot of people are jumping on the intermittent fasting train, and you obviously, first rule is do what works best for you and your schedule and your family. But when we talk about our physiology, we're more insulin sensitive earlier on in the day, specifically when the sun's out. So you want to try to prioritize, if you are going to be eating breakfast, having your breakfast within an hour of eating. So you want to give your body a little bit of time before you wake up. You don't want to just eat right away.
Do you mean an hour of waking?
Out within an hour of waking. Sorry, I might have missed that. And then the earlier you eat in the day, the better, because as I said, you're more insulin sensitive. And then once the sun goes down, you really want to avoid eating anything. And specifically, one of the main rules that I give my clients is try to avoid eating anything 2 to 3 hours before bedtime, because once you're settling down for bedtime, your body should be focused on healing and repairing and regenerating. One of the main things that happens while you sleep is your brain detoxifies, gets rid of all the, waste, so to speak. So you really want to focus on allowing your body to focus on that repair process. And if you eat too close to bedtime, then your body is going to be focused on digestion. And, sometimes this happens if you're out at a social event, you might end up eating a little bit later. And if you have like a wearable tracker, like an Oura ring, you'll notice that your resting heart rate will stay elevated throughout the night because your body has been focused on digesting that food. So timing, best thing I would say is eat your breakfast within an hour of waking. Try to eat most of your meals earlier on in the day before the sun sets, and then try not to eat anything 2 to 3 hours before bedtime.
Awesome. And then is there a breakdown of what people should be eating? How much proteins, carbs, fats? Do you have any suggestions around that, or what their plate or meal should look like?
Yeah, so we commonly talk about a plate formula. So generally speaking, about a quarter of your plate should be a protein. So you want to aim for about 30 grams of protein per meal, half your plate in veggies. The other quarter could be a starchy carb like sweet potato. If you tolerate grains, you could do some whole grains, like a bit of rice, if that's, in your, I guess, in your meal plan. And then having about 1 to 2 servings of fat.
Okay. And where does fruit fit in?
And you can have fruit as well. Usually you want to have fruit at the end of the meal.
Okay. Now I've heard concepts of things like food combining and the order in which to eat your meals. Is there anything you want to share or say about that? Any guidelines around that?
I think it depends on the person. We like to include fruit in our meal plans with our clients because for a lot of people, fruit helps satiate that sweet taste bud. So you want to try to hit all of the taste buds, right? The salty, the sweet, the sour, perhaps, right? Because that's really going to help satisfy your craving, so to speak, if you're having any of those. So fruit at the end of the meal can be a great replacement for dessert for a lot of people. That's, what we did growing up. My mom, this was, something that was my grandparents did and my mom did. Like we'd always have fruit at the end of the meal. For some people, if you combine fruit too close to your proteins and starches, that can cause some gas. I think it's a case by case basis. So you could consider eating fruit more so on an empty stomach if that is the case.
Yeah, if somebody experiences that, then that would be the recommendation is to eat fruit on its own separately
Mm-hmm.
because it generally tends to get metabolized and digested very quickly because it's loaded with its own enzymes. And sometimes, things like protein can take a little bit longer to digest. And it can cause the fruit to start fermenting. So, use your judgment, figure out what works for you. But there are food combining formulas. So they generally say not to combine a protein and a starch together if you can help it. So lean and green. So lean proteins and greens are usually a good combination, or even starches and greens can be a good combination. And this is for people who are struggling with issues, right? Like I can seem to combine all these foods together and I don't seem to have any issues, and neither do you. So it's also going to depend on, our digestive fire. It's going to depend on how well we chew. It's going to depend on what our food tolerances are, the state of our microbiome. So there's a variety of factors that come into play. But if somebody's struggling, then maybe, using food combining principles could be helpful for them. So, the other thing about choose is choosing how we eat, right? So we talked about chewing. Obviously, that's the second C. We talked about choosing the right foods to eat and choosing the right, flute plate formula, so to speak, and the right time of day. But there's also the right conditions in which to eat. So I know that there's been studies that have come out that have indicated that eating in front of a bright screen, either on your phone or in front of a television, can actually increase the amount of blood sugar spike that takes place when somebody is eating the exact same meal. So if you were to eat a specific meal in front of a television versus eating that meal at it, next to a candlelight with your family, it's going to change the biological effect of that meal. And so that's also important for us to note. I grew up, as of course, Deepa, you know this, but many people may not. But I grew up in a family where we would have some meals in front of, with each other at the dinner table. But once Seinfeld became syndicated, that would be our nightly ritual, is to have dinner and watch Seinfeld as a family. And so a lot of times I want to sit and watch Seinfeld or some sort of sitcom in front of the television and eat my meal. It's like my vice, if you will. And you're really good about saying, no, we're going to eat dinner together as a family. So I think we meet each other halfway, somewhere in between. I think it's more, 50-50 or maybe 60-40. And part of it is because for me, there's some nostalgia to watching a sitcom like Seinfeld. It takes me back to a time in my life, and it just really calms and centers my nervous system. And I think that's different than watching the news or something violent, that stresses us out. I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know that studies are showing that watching television, or at least the screen itself, less so what you're watching, but the screen itself, will change the insulin response in the body.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the next C?
Well, we talked about chewing, and I don't want to spend too much time on that. I think if people were to just spend more time chewing their food, that's going to be a good idea for each and every one of us. And again, getting that meal texture down to a liquid is going to be the ideal scenario. Another thing about chewing that is probably worth mentioning is that nowadays many people are drinking their calories. And when we drink our calories, it's easy to consume 3, 4, 500 calories, like in a smoothie or something like that, without even realizing it. But the problem is that when we chug a meal like that, or, chug all those calories, our body didn't really have a chance to prepare for it. So what I encourage people to do is, if they have a smoothie, yes, you can blend nuts into your smoothie. Yes, you can blend hemp seeds and things like that into your smoothie. But a better idea would be to sprinkle some into your smoothie, and then that forces you to chew it. It forces you to chew the nuts or to chew those ingredients like the hemp seeds. And that way you're slowing down the process of just inhaling that smoothie. Chewing also stimulates our jaw. So for young children, it's very important to stimulate their jaw and encourage them to chew hard foods. When we over process foods, and we puree them and soften them, then it doesn't allow the child's jaw to form correctly. And nowadays, children have smaller and smaller jaws. And that some of that has to do with the micronutrient deficiencies, but a lot of that also has to do with the lack of stimulation to the jaw as well. So that's something that can be super helpful for people, and especially young children, to get them to chew their food a little bit more and pay attention to that, because small jaws lead to small airways, which lead to a whole host of other issues as adults. The next C after that is to chill. And this is one that I think is often overlooked. Some people get their meal timing right, they get what they're eating right, they might be chewing their food, but the state in which we eat that meal also makes a big difference. So we have our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, which kind of gets divided into, now maybe three categories with polyvagal theory, but for the purposes of this conversation, we have our fight or flight response and we have our rest and digest response. And that rest and digest response is exactly that. It's when we are primed for recovery, rejuvenation, restoration, and of course, digestion. And so, what happens when we're in that relaxed state, we are sending more blood flow to our digestive organs versus when we're in fight or flight. So, again, eating that healthy meal, but eating it in a stressed out state is going to impair and hamstring your digestive function because digestion is actually very metabolically expensive. This is one of the reasons why if you eat a huge meal, you feel tired afterwards, because every time you eat, you've got to secrete enzymes. Stomach acid is 1,000,000 times more acidic than blood. So it takes a lot of energy to move all those hydrogen atoms and configure them in such a way to produce the acid. You also have to then activate your pancreas. You have to release, pancreatic enzymes and insulin and bile secretions. And of course, every time you eat, your immune system has to meet and greet every ingredient and every, molecule before it enters into your bloodstream. So the immune system becomes activated in the process as well. And then, of course, we have to detox things out. So the liver becomes involved. And then, of course, the surface area of your bowel is 3,000 square feet. So now we're activating all of those cells. So digestion is a very metabolically expensive activity. So we want to send as much energy to that system as we can. But if we're in fight or flight, we're kind of sending a competing message for that function. And so getting into a state of chill, relaxation is very potent and powerful. And ways to do that, one way to do that would be to, express a gratitude, which is our next C. But, saying a prayer, right? Having gratitude as a family, slowing down and having starting off with having a conversation, reviewing the day, right? People are feeling seen and feeling heard, and that relaxes our nervous system. And another thing that we can do is we can take a few deep breaths together, right? So box breathing can be very beneficial. Doing a physiologic sigh can shift us out of that fight or flight state into that parasympathetic state. And then just being conscientious and aware of the position that we're in when we're eating. So a lot of times I find people standing up and eating, and standing is a fight or flight position, right? Versus sitting, which is a rest and digest position. So anytime I'm at an event, people are standing and eating, right? They're eating their hors d'oeuvres and snacks and things like that. I'll walk over to them and say, hey, listen, it's probably way better if you eat and sit and eat versus stand and eat. And then people will, it just makes sense, right? We don't think about it, but it makes perfect sense when you explain it to somebody. So I would say, getting into that chill state, that parasympathetic state, that relaxed state, that rest and digest state is very often overlooked. And of course, when we're in that state, we're going to chew our food more slowly. We're going to be more present. We're going to be more intentional. We're going to taste our food more thoroughly, right? We're going to signal to our body that we're eating and we're relaxed, and we're going to increase and enhance blood flow to the digestive system and be able to process and metabolize that food more effectively. So, chill is something that we all could benefit from, and just slowing down. I think in all areas of our life, most people are go, go, go. And what we need to be is chill, chill, chill. So that's the third C, is to chill. And the next one I kind of spilled into this a little bit is to cherish, right? So cherishing, not just the person that prepared the meal for you, even if you're eating out, right? Just being grateful for, the establishment, the restaurant, the chef, the waiter, right? The dishwashers, like so many people were involved in making that meal possible for you. Even the person that built the table, right, that you're sitting on, or the chair you're sitting on. There's so many layers of gratitude that we can express. And of course, the people that grew the food, right? The soil that provided that food for you, the sun that turned that food into a source of energy for you. Those are all things that we can do or express our gratitude towards. And something like prayer can also be very beneficial as well, right? I think that this is something that, again, often gets overlooked. And praying over your food has scientifically been shown to be very potent and powerful. And then, of course, expressing gratitude, whether you do it, as a group, as a family, or whether you just do it individually in your own mind. I think it just brings your heart into the right place, gets your nervous system into the right state. And of course, you're going to, if you do that, digest that food more completely. So cherish is the last one, or the second last one. And the last one is to check. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit, and we'll definitely get into the different layers of checking, because there's things that you can do for free. And then, of course, you can dive a little bit deeper should you choose to, and do some lab testing as well. So maybe we start with, what are some physical signs that you're digesting your food well?
So with check, you want to make sure that your stools are well formed. So we have the Bristol stool scale, which if you look that up on Google, you'll see that you want to be as close to like a type 4 stool as possible. So well formed. You don't want to see it too hard and little balls. That could be more on the constipation side. And you don't want to see it too loose or watery either. So kind of in between. You also want to look at the color, right? It should be a nice dark brown color. You don't want to see it too light. If it's too light, you're probably not digesting your fats very well. And if it's too dark, then, that's also not ideal as well. So kind of in the middle there. And you can, once again, look something up on Google as well if you're not sure. You also want to make sure that you don't see any undigested food particles in your stool, which could be an indication that you're not chewing your food well. So making sure that you're not seeing any undigested food, right? Especially something like corn can be a very simple way to determine how well you're chewing your food. And, when it comes to check, if you want to dive a little deeper, you can also do something like a GI map stool test, which is going to look at your stool. It's a DNA analysis, and it checks your stool for any pathogenic bacteria, viruses, or parasites. And it looks at whether or not you have H. pylori, which can be very problematic for people. It looks at your commensal bacteria, which is your good bacteria. It looks at whether or not you have any overgrowths of opportunistic bacteria. We all have a certain percentage of those, but if they're overgrown, they're known as the bad bacteria. They can trigger certain autoimmune related issues for people and just be this low level stressor that you may not be aware of. It's also going to look at fungi, parasites, and worms. And then it also looks at your actual digestive function. So how well you're digesting your fats, your carbohydrates, how well you're detoxing, whether there's any inflammation in the bowel, whether there's any occult blood in the bowel. And then also looks at something called gliadin, which is whether or not you're having a reaction to gluten or not. So it's very comprehensive and can really help solve the puzzle for a lot of people if they're having digestive related issues in terms of what might be the underlying cause of some of these issues that they may be experiencing.
All right, thank you. And physically, there's some other things that we can look for as well. So if your stool has a shiny, greasy appearance, that could be an indication of poor fat digestion. If your stool, as you mentioned, has undigested food in it, it could be poor chewing, right? Or it could also be low pancreatic enzyme function. If your stool is the color of a cardboard box, that could indicate that your gallbladder and liver aren't secreting enough bile. And so that could also be an indication of some malabsorption issues. And another thing is that you never want blood in your stool. If your stool is ever black, then that could indicate that there's bleeding in the upper GI tract. If there's red blood in your stool, then you could have a hemorrhoid, or there could be some bleeding lower in the bowel. And, if that's the case, you always want to get that checked out. Another thing is hemorrhoids, right? Hemorrhoids are often caused by liver congestion. So just something to keep in mind. Varicose veins, hemorrhoids are caused by liver congestion, but the symptom may show up obviously in the bowel. The other thing to keep in mind is bloating and belching. So bloating shortly after a meal is never normal. It's quite common these days, but it's never normal. It could indicate a overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine. And heartburn is something that is very common as well, and that's never normal either. Usually heartburn is caused by a lack of stomach acid, contrary to popular belief. And what ends up happening is food sits in your stomach longer than it should. And this results in the food becoming literally rotting inside your stomach, increasing lactic acid buildup, which then, you end up creating pressure with, and then you regurgitate that or belch that up, and that causes the burning sensation. So that's never normal. And just something to keep in mind, things that can help with that. Enzymes can be beneficial for some people. Even betaine hydrochloride can be beneficial. Again, you want to do all the things that we talked about in today's session, and that usually knocks it out. So one of the things that we often like to do is start with the basics. And what we find is 9 times out of 10, choose, chew, chill, cherish is going to knock out most of the issues. And then, visually inspecting your stool, those are things that can be helpful in cluing you in if something's going in the wrong direction. And then, of course, I suggest annually getting a stool test done, just so you have eyes and ears on what's going on internally, because looking at your stool doesn't always tell the whole story. There could be pathogens, overgrowth of bacteria, dysbiosis, as Deepa mentioned, and we want to address those things long before they become symptomatic. We see lots of people with parasites, and sometimes people have no symptoms despite having parasites, because it can take years for these symptoms to develop. I'll share a quick story and then we'll wrap things up. My son, when we went to Costa Rica, we came back, and a week or so later, he started belching, and we just thought he was being a kid. I think he was like 4 or 5 at the time. And we're like, he's just being a boy. He's just being a boy. He'll grow out of this. And, kids go through phases. And then it just persisted and continued. And we're like, what the heck's going on here? Why does this kid keep belching like this? And shortly afterwards, we got a message from the WhatsApp group from others who were on that trip. And many of them became debilitated with parasites. Some people had to quit their jobs, and some people had to go to the hospital because of their upset stomachs and things like that. Meanwhile, Deepa and I had no symptoms, and Devin had this belching issue going on. So we actually put him on a parasite protocol. And one day I was wiping him and pulled out a worm from his butt. I'm like, okay, that means that we probably should do this as well. Even though we didn't have any symptoms, we took the precautionary measure to not wait until we had symptoms to do something about it. So, almost everyone has parasites, whether you like to, believe it or not. 100% of people with pets have parasites. So if you have a cat or a dog, chances you have parasites. And not all parasites live in the gut. Some of them live in the brain. Some of them live in your sinus cavity. Some of them live in your mouth. Some of them live in your heart, right? Some of them live in your intestinal tract. Some of them may even be in the uterus or the vagina. So there's other areas where parasites and pathogens can be found as well. So something to keep in mind, something to be aware of, and definitely something to address if you have any inkling that there might be something going on. And one thing to also keep in mind is that the stool test won't always pick it up. So we have to not just rely on testing, we have to rely on taking a good clinical history on our clients and then making an assessment, right? What seems to be the most likely culprit here, and how do we fix that? So covered a lot today. There's obviously a lot more that we could cover when it comes to digestive health. It's one of the key pillars that we cover in our Living Light program. And what we find is that most people's digestion is unfortunately compromised. And of course, digestion is how we extract nutrition from the outside world, and how we extract energy from the outside world. One of the ways, certainly. And we want to make sure that our digestive function is optimal for life. Okay. And so we're very adamant about creating healthy digestion, not just eating healthy, but making sure that the food is assimilated and nourishing our bodies, and the waste is also eliminated as well. It would behoove me not to mention something simple like using a squatty potty. So all of you should be using a squatty potty. It's just a way to get your knees above your hips, because that ensures that you're going to have a more complete bowel movement. So we'll leave it at that for now. Maybe we'll do a part 2, Deepa, and do a deeper dive. I know we've got some world-class experts that can come in and talk about the microbiome and other elements of digestion. So we'll definitely save that for a future episode. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap things up today?
No, I think that was a good first part 1, I guess. We'll definitely do a part 2 because there's so much more.
Yeah, maybe even a part 3, 4, 5. Like, this is a very extensive topic, but we started with the basics just to give you all an overview. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please share this with somebody else. Comment below what your biggest takeaway was. And of course, subscribe to our channel. It's one way that more people can see this information. And as always, thank you. We love you. We appreciate you. Here's to health, wholeness, and happiness for you, your family, and your loved ones. And here's to becoming the doctor of the future, which is you. Bye for now. Have an amazing, amazing rest of your day.